If you're interested in memoirs that address some pretty controversial topics, or at least have a controversial take on much of our modern political world, then today's book just might be for you. Today I'll be reviewing Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative by Glenn Lowry. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today I'll be taking a look at a memoir. Glenn Lowry is a well-known economist. He has taught at Harvard, MIT, I think University of Michigan. I think he spent most of his time at Boston University. And he has also been well known with his association with certain political movements. Most famously in the 80s, he was closely associated with the Reagan presidency, and he even had some associations with the Trump presidency. In this book, he details his life, and just to give you a bare bones basic look at it, because it's a very long book, I don't have any real interest in giving you all the ins and outs. It's, I think, like 450 pages or so. But he is born in the south side of Chicago. He is born in a pretty complicated family relationship. He is raised by somewhat distant relatives, grandma and aunts and stuff. He's not raised by his mother or his father, although he seemed to have a relationship with both growing up. His relationship with his father is probably one of the most interesting. He comments on it a fair amount. He doesn't talk all that much about his relationship with his mother. He seems to be a little more resentful towards her, but his father is actually going to be well educated. He has a degree in it was either accounting or finance, something along the lines, but he also has a graduate degree. And he even says growing up that his father initially didn't have all that much money, but after he finished his degree, he would take them places, take them on trips. And so he plays a pretty big role in his life, despite the fact that he does not actually grow up with him. He only sees him, every other weekend or so. And he grows up on the South Side in, I guess, a rough neighborhood. He does not give a whole lot of details. He does suggest that the school he goes to is not very good. He discusses opportunities at possibly going to more exclusive high schools, especially the lab school at the University of Chicago, or getting into some other kind of school in the larger Chicago area. But he doesn't. He just sticks with whatever school he gets into, and he appears to do pretty well in school. At least it comes to him easily, but he finds himself frequently just at odds with everyone around him. He is constantly trying to prove himself. And of course, he makes all sorts of dumb decisions growing up that are, I would say, pretty typical of most guys, although he goes a step further in some cases. He ends up stealing a car at one point. He experiments with drugs. He is constantly trying to hook up with women. That's a recurring theme throughout the book. He says early on that that was something he wanted to do more than anything in high school. And he says he was not very successful at it in high school, but you'll see throughout the book that it's something that he continues to pursue, and it actually becomes, unfortunately, one of the defining features of him, but we'll get into more detail with that later. He briefly goes to the Illinois Institute of Technology. He flunks out, or he just chooses not to go back. I think it was a combination of both. And then after he gets his girlfriend pregnant, and he doesn't quite marry her yet, but they start their life together, and he starts trying to put his life together by getting a full-time job. But he also starts going to community college, where they encourage him to apply to Northwestern. He goes to Northwestern, where he does very well, and then he goes and gets his PhD at MIT. And along the way, he is going to find himself much more closely associated with certain people that give him an in with the developing conservative movement throughout the 70s, which is what's going to lead him to being associated with the Reagan administration in the 80s. He, of course, outlines his reasoning and what leads him to believe in his political convictions, especially when it's any policies that are geared towards any kind of race or socioeconomic relationships, especially when it comes to the Black community. And he is frequently employed by gas companies who find his attitudes towards a more laissez-faire approach to economics very encouraging, and so they use him essentially as a method for promoting deregulation. One of the things that he seems to champion that gets him so closely associated with Reagan. However, starting in the 90s, a lot of issues from his past just seem to keep seeping up. And like I said, probably the most obvious one is how often he finds himself womanizing, despite the fact that he is married. His first marriage is going to fall apart. He is then going to get married again. That marriage never ends, not until his wife passes away. But throughout it, he is constantly seeking validation through pretty much any way of hooking up with girls, whether that is getting prostitutes, or he, matter of fact, finds himself trying to give you this economist rationale for why it's okay to get prostitutes. He is going to be pursuing young graduate students. He's going to be pursuing just anyone that he thinks is of interest, and that is going to be a great deal of the book, just so you know. But then he also goes into details about his addiction to crack cocaine. For some reason, feels the need to tell you how to make a crack pipe. I guess he thought that that was an important part of his story. By this point, he had become a pretty public figure. He was teaching at Harvard, and because of his association with the Reagan presidency, he is a well-known individual, and all that's going to force him to restart, try to find his footing, and to not only, again, establish himself as some kind of public figure, but also dealing with his own marriage and his own personal relationships. And after he spent some time in various programs trying to help him get his life in order, and, as I've said, continuing to deal with the fallout with his extramarital affairs with his wife, he is eventually going to find himself a decent footing at Boston University. And that is where he is going to probably become a much more visible figure in trying to establish a well-known conservative bent on economics, especially as it's reflected in race relationship. And I could go on. There's so much that I could say that is in this book. So let me just cut to the chase and say who I think it's for and who I don't think it's for. Well, I actually am not entirely sure who it's for. I'm not sure why he wrote this book. I think the fact that he puts an emphasis on the confessions part is why he did this. He wants to simply acknowledge all the mistakes he made. I won't say that he seems particularly repentant. I mean, at every point, he only changes his life because he gets caught. And on top of that, he frequently reverts back to the issues and all of the problems from before. The only thing that he ever really seems to completely overcome is his addiction to crack, for which I applaud him. But we're talking decades and decades and many, many chances where he will get caught with his philandering and then he will still return back to it. And I don't think he does a great job of explaining why that's so important to tell that story, aside from simply confessing. I think he tries to justify it as it being part of a larger attitude towards womanizing that he felt like was part of his growing up. He does mention an uncle that gives him this jacket that is meant to be this point of pride because he is going to woo so many women in his bachelor pad, and he frequently references that and how proud he thinks that uncle would be. And so I think he is suggesting that that is the justification or the underlying reason why he is constantly pursuing other women. I'm not entirely sure. And I did not feel like it was by any means a valuable lesson that he was trying to present by outlining all the various forms of women that he cheated on, sleeping with his best friend's wife, and all those different things. I just didn't think that that was very interesting, let alone I didn't feel like I had any great story to tell. So if you're interested in basically the gossipy part of his life, then this book might be for you. Of course, the second part of that is his insistence that he is conservative. If you're here for that book, that's also going to be a little harder to really justify because he does not discuss anything about his way of thinking or his attitudes towards economics until about halfway through the book. And even then, it's only bits and pieces of it. It's not until probably the last, 50 pages that he tries to really put some emphasis on why it is that he becomes conservative, especially since he goes from being conservative in the 80s to being a little more liberal in the 90s and early 2000s. And then it is in the 20 teens that he actually becomes conservative again, primarily in response to the Black Lives Matter movement. And he seems to have a real antipathy towards Barack Obama and the fact that he says that he found Donald Trump to be very appealing. All of these seems to be the big reasons that he considers himself conservative again. But if you're here for that, you will not find a lot of that throughout this book. You'll only really see it at the end, which I don't know why he would put that in the subtitle of the book if it wasn't a primary focus. I'm sure he writes much more about it elsewhere. I'm not going to go seek it out. I did not find this guy remotely interesting by the end of the book. I was impressed at how successful he was. I was very impressed that he was able to do so much despite constantly spending all of his time and money on other pursuits, namely pursuing women, and at times his addictions to drugs would have really cost him a great deal of money. Even being a well-paid professor at a well-known university, I still can't imagine where all of his money went or where all of his time went and how he managed to still be a productive member of the faculty with a teaching load and a fair amount of research. One of the things that he is known for is how much research that he has produced. I don't think he has any well-read or popular books, but it seems within the field of economics, he is a relatively well-known name. I would recommend it for individuals that are looking for that element of his story, the encouraging aspect, the fact that he does come from a challenging neighborhood, yet he managed to make so much in his life. There is something to that worth recognizing. If you're here for a better understanding of his policies and why he believes what he believes, that I think you're going to find much harder to fully understand or to reconcile with really anything else that he says. And I definitely am not going to recommend this to any of my conservative or liberal friends, because I just don't think that he is a great representative of any of the messages that he's trying to promote. The fact that he spends so much time discussing all the different ways that he cheated on his wife or his girlfriends, or just the way that he essentially abandoned his family at many different points, and yet he puts a real focus on the traditional nuclear family, he himself just seems like a really bad messenger for that type of message. And so I don't think conservatives would get much out of that. And for liberals, they're obviously not going to agree with what he says anyway. So I really am not sure who I'd recommend this for. But please, if you have a difference of opinion, let me know. If you felt like you really got something out of this and you felt like there was more to that message, please let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications. Until next time, keep those pages turning.